Victor Palmieri is the retired chairman and founder of the Palmieri Company. He's a lawyer, the former ambassador at large and U.S. coordinator for refugee affairs in the Department of the State during the Carter administration, and he was a moderator for the public TV series, The Advocates, a Peabody Award-winning series.
Thank you.
I should just mention the panel's two things. I'm sorry, Victor.
Okay.
Your cell phones and BlackBerries can fritz out your mics, so keep them off or far. And when you want to talk, when you've got a comment, grab your name tag. We're stealing this from the Aspen Institute. They've got a great method so you don't have to sit there with your hand in the air. If you take your name card and put it up on its side, then Victor will know that you have a comment that you want to make. All right, Victor, all yours.
Thank you, Stephanie, and good afternoon. I'm happy to be here and see all of you here. And I'm under a lot of pressure here because they've installed an earpiece. And my recollection goes back to my high school days when I played Cyrano and my nose fell off. Never have I faced such a crisis, and I hope this earpiece stays on. Well, okay, we're going to get started. And we couldn't have had a better introduction than we had this morning. Those presentations were absolutely exhilarating, particularly for those of us who haven't been as close to the issues as I should have been, perhaps, for this role. But I want to start with a question that was certainly written large this morning, and that's the imminent death of newspapers, particularly local newspapers. Thought I might ask Mike Sweeney what he thinks of that. You probably didn't realize I was going to call on you for that purpose, huh? So, Mike, what do you think?
Well, that didn't take long, did it? Well, I'm happy to be here, and I agree with virtually everything that was discussed this morning. Some of the statistics that were presented we differ with, particularly with regard to our own newspaper, but I think overall what we have here is a massively dynamic market with new entrants, digital competitors, digital-only competitors, newsprint competitors, hybrid competitors. It's a dynamic market. Now, I think the question at hand is whether or not newspapers can compete in such a dynamic market. I've been with the Star Tribune only 2 months, and I've been surprised at a number of the things that I've seen since I've gotten involved. For instance, the readership of the Star Tribune has never been higher than it is today. Now, some of my friends look only at print circulation, and strangely, it's some of my digital friends who only quote print circulation. But when you look at the combined StarTribune.com and our print readership, it's never been higher than it is today. So
what if you don't look at .com?
It's down 5%.
Okay.
Is where we are.
Just for the record.
Okay. No, I think that's fair. But why would we look, Victor? Why would we look just at print? Now, the question ultimately gets to the economic model. The reason you'd only look at print is because we have a proven economic model in print, and we don't on the digital side. But here's the way I'd look at that question. Our business and Google's business are very similar. They're similar in the sense that Google uses search to aggregate a large audience. We use news to aggregate a large audience. Clearly, in the Twin Cities, we have the largest audience of any media organization. In fact, we reach more people than any organization in Minnesota. Once you get that audience aggregated, then our business and Google's is the same. We do commerce with that group of people who come to us for information. Now, over time, I suspect that our organization and others that are forward-thinking news organizations will spend half of their time thinking like Edward R. Murrow and the other half thinking like Eric Schmidt. And you're going to see that kind of innovation from us in 2010. And I think you'll see innovation from newspaper organizations, traditional newspaper organizations, over the next couple of years. The thing that I disagree with that seemed to be implied this morning is that newspaper organizations will have no reaction to this changing environment. Now, coming from outside the industry, I'm beginning to develop a sense as to why that's difficult. There are some hidebound traditions on both the journalistic side and the sales side of news organizations that make innovation difficult. But if Eric Schmidt were running this business, he'd have innovative products and ideas, and I think you're going to see more from us along those lines. Now, as I sit here in the belly of the beast of our largest competitor, over time, for the Star Tribune, the largest competitor will be Minnesota Public Radio. Not the Pioneer Press, not MinPost, no other news organization. 10 years from now, our biggest competitor will be NPR. Now, I hesitate, sitting here in the belly of the beast, to talk a whole lot about what our business plan is going to be. Bill was taking notes over lunch as we started to talk about this a little bit.
Well, that was going to be my next question and ask you to release your financials, but we
will, Victor. We're going to publish our financials on a quarterly basis like a public company does.
Let me go non-urban for a moment and ask Jim Julian, what's your reaction? We've heard from the center of the metropolis here. Tell me how you react to what you just heard from Mike Sweeney.
In Grand Rapids, which is where I live, located about 4 hours north, just for the folks that maybe could benefit by a little information about what I mean as rural. I live in a community of 8,000 people in a county of 42, and I'm not here as a practitioner or a professional in the media field. I'm wearing a philanthropy hat. The founder of our philanthropy.
That's a hat we appreciate.
Thank you. The founder of our philanthropy, Mr. Blandon, in fact, owned the St. Paul Pioneer Press at one time, and he accumulated his wealth when he sold the paper to the Ritters. But to get back to your question, from the perspective, not of a practitioner, but of someone who lives in a rural community, the answer would be, to your question, we hope so. We depend on the survivability of local newspapers. And what we need is not just the information from local newspapers or from the Star Tribune, but what we need is the service the papers provide really to connect our community to each other. Our paper in Grand Rapids, our local paper, comes out twice a week. People laugh that the size of your funeral may depend upon the day you die, because the obituary might come out after the funeral. I offer that as an example of the important role of newspapers and their survivability, not just, again, to provide information, but their survivability really does impact the strength of many, many communities.
Well, to what extent can the digital media supply the sense of community? Can they ever take the place of that Grand Rapids newspaper?
Yeah, you're asking someone who has read the Grand Rapids paper for about 55 years. So my answer again from that perspective is no. And I think part of what's missing was talked about this morning. Two things. We look, I believe, in rural communities for the newspaper to validate something, to validate the idea for a school bond referendum. Yep, there's a little bit of watchdog role that we need that goes on there. But today, I would be uncertain as to how the digital media could provide the legacy and the validation of community projects.
Let me ask Doug Carlston. Doug, can digital ever supply that sense of community?
Certainly can.
Speak into your mic, would you please?
It can, I think. It's not clear, however, that the form is going to look anything like what we're used to thinking of as a newspaper. In fact, there's a wide range of tools that digital provides, and they're used in a lot of different ways. But many of them are, in fact, they strengthen community as one of your affinity groups or one of your affiliation groups that you belong to. It makes it easy for groups of people to connect. We talk about social networking as though it existed independent of your real life, but in fact, they're often used very, very effectively within your real life for your church, your school, or just the town that you live in. And for purposes that can include the passing of information, passing of local news back and forth.
Laura Walker, what can you add to that?
Speaking from the public radio's perspective and from New York City, I think that there are a lot of things that the combination of radio or print and the digital media can do that couldn't have been done before. I would add crowdsourcing is something in what Minnesota has been doing with the public insight work that they've been doing that combines both the digital media so that you've got reporters out in the form of real people covering things. But I do think we have to be careful to also know that there's a place for the journalists to be there and for people, to know that they're being held accountable in a way that only journalists can do.
How do you deal with the internet philosophers who would tell you that the future lies in interactive, that the audience has to be equally online or equally on air?
I guess I would go back to Tom Rosensteel's first exercise, which was to ask how many people were reading and how many people were blogging, and not everyone is going to want to participate. And I do think, however, that there's huge opportunity in that, in how we can, as media, get people involved, but it actually raises the bar for us as journalists and as people who are convening discussion, because the really unique qualities that we can bring, which is that validation, and it is, it's like you think about what, at Fort Hood, when many of the news media were listening to a 30-year-old, woman who was telling us that the killer was dead, and it wasn't validated. We have to make sure that that even as we get more and more information from the ground, we're validating it, we're also sifting it and applying a real critical eye.
To what extent do you feel, I should say, does anyone here on the panel feel that journalism, whether it's a local, in the sense of a local newspaper or public radio, or for that matter, metropolitan papers, has really done anything to help the public cope with the kind of multiple crises that we've got in this country today, in terms of both our foreign involvements, our economy, and what some would say a culture that has gone steadily downhill. To what extent is journalism playing a role in getting through to the population with information that bears on everything that's happening? Certainly, a large segment of our population enjoys a lot of information, but a bigger segment of our population, and this is a question, is it profiting by the technology, the developments that we've heard so much about? What would you say, John?
To the specific question of how much of society benefits?
Yeah.
I think there's, as you say, I think there's a broad continuum of participation, a broad continuum of access still. If broadband is the new electricity, we're nowhere close to universal electricity. There are haves and have-nots right now. I don't know, I'm not a prophet to predict whether whether broadband will so equalize access as to eliminate that.
On today's session, you don't admit you're not a prophet. Not a prophet.
And I didn't hear anything this morning that made me more of one. I think that the audience, in our case, the audience, the subscribers in the case of a newspaper, viewers in the case of television, vote every time they consume. I often say that I've never met anyone who's listened to the wrong radio station. We choose to consume what it is that we value, whether it's reading a newspaper or whether it's visiting a website or watching a television program. And I do think there's disparity, and I don't believe that we're going to eliminate the disparity so that all things that a news organization does will equally benefit the entire sector of community. That's also why I think the challenge is not one platform or even one healthy news organization. I think we have to be talking about, particularly in the context of regional or local news, what it takes to create a healthy ecosystem that's going to inform the broadest range of communities. Many of us have different parts to play in that, but I think we have to look at whether it's a diversity of voices or a diversity of media, certainly a diversity of journalistic organizations in a healthy community.
Jim Dolan?
I think we have to think of something basic here about media. Any successful medium is probably successful because it serves at least one community well, and maybe more than one community, but it's a community level of focus and involvement that makes it successful. And I think that that applies to all media, whether it's print or electronic or broadcast. And that's just a truism that I think we lose sight of sometimes. And a community like Grand Rapids has a focused print newspaper that's good for that. Print is a good choice there. There could be online choices too. The challenge we're focusing on a lot as we look at big problematic companies is, what does the Star Tribune do? This metro area of 3.5 million people, how many communities are there? How many thousands of communities are there? Because communities are defined not just by geography, but by interest. So you can have a interest that's worldwide, if it's a hobby of yours or your work of some kind. So defining communities is much more difficult than it's ever been now. But we can't just say we're going to be the medium for all 4 million people without having to rethink how we do it.
Narrowcasting is the future?
I believe people narrowcast on their own. So I think to the extent we understand that and turn it to our advantage as business people, we are better off and they are better off too. If we try to force a one-size-fits-all solution on them, that will not work. And I think newspaper as a medium is a flawed way to deliver to a large, complicated market. And I think that the news company underlying the Star Tribune is a viable, healthy company with lots of future. But to the extent that it insists on print as the primary medium, I think it's a very troubled future for that company.
Scott, how would you respond?
Well, I wanted to pivot off that and Jim's comment. You know, we were asking newspapers to do an incredible, awesome, even perform an array of functions. On the one hand, they're supposed to be an artistic, intellectual, even you know, purely academic exercise where they're researching and writing, and then on the other hand, they're being required to perform a very industrial function of delivery and printing press and ink, and I just think that what's happening is kind of an unbundling of those tasks, and you know, why they should have authority just because they go through that industrial process of printing and distributing, I don't think is the only mechanism that is required to gain authority. But I have thought often about what is authority and what can we do to create the community that we're worried about losing. And I think that at first we focused mostly on creating an institution that was just as trustworthy, that just simply didn't have that enormous cost of printing, ink, and distribution. But now there's even better and more interesting ideas coming out about how you create that community and authority. This Clay Shirky has just come out and coined a term, I think, algorithmic authority, that you gain authority and credibility in the community by proving how you get the information and demonstrating that the process is unique and authoritative and genuine, and that by doing that you prove and you can provide the kind of validation or whatnot that you may have seen in many ways in a flawed way in the past by simply just stamping it in the past, and now the sheets are being pulled back and you can see exactly what happened. I don't know that that's the golden you know, answer, but I also think that there are new ways to pursue that community that are being pursued all across the country right now.
Ken? Ken Doctor, your mic.
I'm pushing the button here. I agree with the comments here. One thing that strikes me off of those, clearly this is a niche, narrow-casted world that's developing. That's clear. When we enter these questions of public policy that Victor, you're raising, of, you know, we got big problems in this country we're trying to solve, and how well are we using the new stuff to deal with them? I think this is a fascinating question, because we're talking about this morning how what the digital technology is really good at is immediacy. And I think Tom talked about, you know, that's how people use it. You know, this whole question of depth and breadth and what we could use the term public policy is really hard. And I think we're very much in the infancy of figuring out how to use this medium to really impact big questions. So for right now, for instance, we have healthcare debate and Afghanistan, right? Two huge issues, lots of angles to them. A lot of good reporting, but fairly traditional reporting. And you could take, you know, organizations like New York Times, NPR, among others, national ones, trying to get at that stuff. I can't think of really good ways, though, or really impactful ways that digital media has made a difference in the healthcare debate or the Afghanistan debate, for instance. I don't think we've figured out how to do that. And I think that public policy frontier is really something that we ought to really focus on, of how to harness this technology in light of all these other trends, because this is the gap that is yawning as newspapers, especially in regional areas, go away.
I want to stay on that for a moment. Who can add to what we've heard just now from Ken Doctor about the impact on public policy issues? Was that going to be yours, Kenzie, was it?
I was actually going to go back to an earlier point, but I mean, just one quick observation on that. I think, we talked about digital media being very effective at immediacy. It's also very effective, obviously, at social connection, and I think that's an area where we haven't begun to explore how that can affect these kinds of debates. Clearly also in terms of databasing large amounts of information and exposing information in ways that are not nearly as linear and not as traditional in the way that we've reported them, is another area of opportunity that has been explored to some extent, but not, again, I think we've just barely begun to scratch the surface.
So what were you going to say?
On the question of the role of newspapers and whether they'll survive and in what form, just a couple of thoughts there. I think you have to distinguish between the printed product, and my view would be simply that in this period of transition, however long it is, and disruption, successful media companies will likely rely on a variety of different delivery vehicles, because the disruption of the business model is occurring at different rates, or the adoption of a new business model is occurring at different rates across different platforms. So print will be around as long as its relatively high cost structure is justified by the still higher CPMs that it commands on the advertising side. And when that's no longer the case, it'll go away, whether it's 4 years or 5 years or 10 years. I think that's a different question than whether newspaper institutions are going to be the vehicle. Newspaper organizations are going to be one of the primary vehicles for sort of the emergence of the next generation of news. And I think that's going to be a very mixed picture. As somebody who worked inside newspapers for 30 years, I think they face enormous challenges because they are optimized for operational efficiency, not for innovation, not for adaptation. They're all about doing the same thing over and over again, day in and day out. And some will figure out how to overcome that, transcend it. Others, I think, will find themselves hobbled by that.
Joel?
Yeah, I think the really important question is can we find a model for financing public affairs journalism, irrespective of what institution it gets done in?
Oh, really? There's a financial issue buried here somewhere?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't heard that much about it yet in this panel, but I'm going to bring it up, okay? I think the problem is not which institution survives. It's not whether newspapers can adapt or whether public radio plays a bigger role. I think the bigger problem is let me say it this way, a lot of exciting things are happening in the democratization of information flow. Many more people can participate. Many people can be citizen journalists or critics and interactive players in the process. But some of us believe, I think many in this room believe, that democracy requires a professional category of journalism that is done by people who can be dedicated to it and who have the time and the independence to find out what's going on and tell the truth about it in a dispassionate, useful way. And that's incredibly important to society, even if not everybody reads it as it's written. It filters through to all levels of society. And my concern is that, there are a certain number of people who like to just bash the people who've been doing it and say they don't get it, they're not innovative enough, they're not trying hard enough. Well, I can tell you, I used to be a newspaper publisher. Now I run a nimble, innovative, fast-moving, ever-changing little site, okay? And we are aimed at this public policy sector, okay, and trying to talk about issues. But I'm concerned that the problem is not the lack of imagination on the part of the players. The problem is a structural problem that the advertising that used to support media because of the pricing power of the publishers is evaporating. And that it's not a failure of imagination that it's evaporating, it's a structural problem, which is why, by the way, I actually think there's a lot of opportunity in the nonprofit sector, because I think we've got to get more money from the readers. I don't think we're going to get enough from any kind of advertising. And to get it from the readers, there are numerous ways to go about that, but the nonprofit model is one of the ways to go about it, because you can ask people for the money, and maybe 10% of the people will give you the money. And it turns out that's similar to what the for-profits are finding when they try to figure out how many people will pay them. So I think the critical issue is, how can any of us figure out going forward how to generate enough revenue to pay for serious journalism, not worry too much about which institutions make it and which ones don't, but will anyone make it?
So, John Rash, there's some kinds of journalism that are very expensive to produce and some that aren't. Will the current strictures that we have financially all lead to the latter?
Well, part of the professional portfolio that I have that's in the advertising community is struggling with many, if not all, of these same issues. And, you know, behind the scenes, you've seen a lot of the dynamic disruption happening with advertising companies that you're, of course, seeing in the media that, you know, they try to support and that they need to disseminate their messages. So most ad agencies and most marketers are relatively agnostic in terms of how their messages go out. You do have some generational dynamics in terms of relatively younger people at agencies, as is naturally human, probably favoring some of the media forms that they spend more time on. But the way that I think that most marketers are looking at newspapers are define what a newspaper is. And, you know, I've had a front row seat on this from a couple different perspectives. I started at Campbell Mithun 25 years ago, and within the first few months I got a big booklet from CBS called The Cable Fable. And it was all about the fable of cable television and how it really was not going to amount to much. Well, if you go to the end of the story, which you're not supposed to, what it should have said is, of course, what CBS is now as part of Viacom is one of the largest purveyors of cable in the world. This week, and perhaps while we're here on the panel, Comcast will buy NBC, especially because of the cable networks. And yet, NBC itself remains an incredibly important investment for them as well. And so looking at it from the perspective of being at the Star Tribune as part of my professional life as well right now, you know, certainly the paper and then papers around the country are aggressively taking this on, and I would argue at a much more aggressive and quicker response rate than the television business did, and yet the television not only survived, it's thriving right now. So, you know, I clearly remain an optimist in terms of there is not just a way out of this, but a way to really build a successful business model, and marketers are looking for that to happen as well. So I think the good news for everyone on the panel, everyone in the room, and all the citizens out there who are concerned about journalism is there are media investment monies available, you know, to those who can build the better media mousetrap. And I think there's a lot of innovation going on right now that these types of conferences and dialogues didn't happen at the start of the last big disruption in cable television.
John, it's great to have an optimist in the house. So, Merrill.
Someone who's had my card up for a while, I'm going to try to tie my comments of 15 minutes ago to now, and that is to make a sweeping but not completely true statement. And at the end of the day, a whole lot of what we're talking about is rotten leadership. And Ken Doctor and Kinsey Wilson and I and others of us who've been involved in the internet since the 90s are not that smart collectively, although Ken claims to be particularly smart. We're not that smart collectively, but at the end of the day, we all saw something coming that was going to change the publishing business forever. And we can look around us and see the amount of dramatic change that's occurred since the mid-90s, and it rounds to zero. Newspapers continue to publish websites that are basically publishing their newspaper online on a different platform. Their ad models have changed only around the fringes. It took a guy like Sweeney showing up after a bankruptcy to get new leadership into the industry. By and large, the leadership is the same. They've done very little. And what ties this together is that their business failures are as serious and are in tandem with their editorial failures. So in our failure to understand the Middle East properly, in our failure to understand the financial crisis of last fall that continues in utterly unknown ways that journalism isn't helping us enough with, in all of that, it's a failure of leadership. And thankfully, there are people like Joel over there starting new institutions because the old ways have failed across the board.
And until, again, people like Michael Sweeney and other new blood come into business, nothing's going to change, which is why a conference like this is encouraging, because it's about the development of new institutions.
Doug, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think there are two models that are often brought up on the issue of profitability and the effect that the digital world will have on this. And one has to do with the what I call the Wikipedia model, the idea that citizen journalism will somehow push your costs down towards zero, that you'll have lots of volunteers, and somehow the editorial process will emerge. And people do like to quote the accuracy checks between Wikipedia and other encyclopedias, and that it's stood up pretty well. There are a lot of reasons I don't actually buy into that one and don't think that it makes a whole lot of sense, one of which is the enormous filtering and editorial component that's needed as you get to a surfeit of information, which is where we're all headed in our own lives, thanks also to the digital world. But the second model, which is represented by a lot of people in this room, is essentially the citizen payer model, the subscription model, not in terms of receiving cash for news, which I don't think works particularly well, but of people participating, making contributions to support what they view as a community of which they are a member. And one of the reasons I think public media has worked is because there is that sense of membership and belonging. It works also in political advocacy groups like Move On, where people feel they have a direct role in the selection of policies and promotional approaches, and it's a very much larger sense of participation than simply as your funding source. And so I think that model can work, but it probably involves a relationship that's closer to public radio's relationship with its members than newspapers' relationship with their readership.
Well, I'm looking for somebody who will follow up on Meryl's comments about leadership just for the moment. Louise, anything to say on that subject?
Your mic.
Microphone.
I'm not going to say anything that's very important on this. The obvious is leadership is everything, and we all know that. I think I would, if I can cross over to leadership at Southern California Public Radio, what I've seen there in 9 years with leadership is tripled revenue and tripled audience, which is pretty impressive. And I think you can't say too much about developing the brand. And so I think leadership stands for something, and it stands for the brand. And I think in all the work, I've worked in cable television, where branding, and of course, in most areas, but it was very critical. So I think the brand that public radio has, and I may not have all the information, Meryl gave some information, I think stands for credibility. We need to verify that that's the case. But I think that is a very incredible, strong brand, and also the financial model for public radio, having worked in commercial, and where the cost is so high, that if you combine public radio, particularly in a market like Los Angeles, with a very video-rich website, which we don't have at this point, you have a really very strong financial model to work off of. But some others can say more about leadership. Thank you.
All right. Well, I want to ask Meryl whether, in fact, you think we've said enough about leadership. You were pretty strong on that
No, we
point.
haven't. I've got something to add about that, about leadership, if I could.
All right,
Just my
please do.
point again. I think that we have, there's an evolution here. This is a classic mature industry that's been through something that I think it's helpful to talk about. In the 1920s, circulation was about 50% of revenues for American newspapers. By the 1950s, it was 30%. By the 1980s, it was 20%. You make 80% of your money in a business from selling ads, 20% from readers. You actually lose money on circulation, but you make it up by selling more ads. That's the setup. Now, the trap is when you go public. And I run a public company, so I maybe too familiar with this. But When you go public, the market is relentless at wanting more numbers, better numbers, higher numbers all the time. It is relentless. And you've set yourself up for a situation in which you underinvest in content because the market pushes you to do that. And you're not rewarded. It's a conscience thing. If your conscience says, I want a better newspaper, I will spend the money, you do it. A lot of publishers did, some publishers didn't. As an industry, we underinvested in content for years. We lost some of our skills. Some of our tools got dull when it came to understanding what readers need. Now when we most need that, we don't have it. And now the public companies have gone private or have gone out of business or they're off the picture to one extent or another. And we're kind of in a trap here that was many, many years in the making. And the smart people, the aggressive people who are not stuck with the investment and all of the legacies that we have are coming in and eating our lunch.
Well, isn't this sort of the nature of the institutional beast? That is to say, it has its day. It sort of crystallizes its process.
In a way, but if you've never heard of creative destruction?
Well, in fact, I've heard a lot about it. I'm not sure I've seen that much of it. Well, let's see, who has a... Ken, you has your wait a minute.
I want
to go first to some people here who have before you. Let's go to Mike.
Well, on the leadership issue, I think leadership in the industry is changing pretty quickly, and it's becoming a much more innovative group. But I'll tell you, when I look at the work that Renee Sanchez and Nancy Barnes do every day in managing the newsroom at the Star Tribune, I'm thrilled with that leadership. I'm thrilled with the quality of journalism that's come out. I'm thrilled with the way they've innovated the news gathering and news dissemination process. They're doing it efficiently, and they're doing it very well. So there's very strong leadership in the industry, particularly on the news side. Now, a lot of the comments have referred to the economic model for newspapers. Let me just tell you this. The Star Tribune's revenue is about $200 million a year, and we'll generate this year between $20 and $25 million of operating cash flow. We have $34 million in cash on the balance sheet. We're certainly not going away anytime soon. Now, that said, we see a way forward in terms of the economic model that can support all this. Without getting deep into our business plan, let me just say that the basic notion that revenue comes from either paid content or advertising, and there's only those two choices, is very, very limiting. The media world in large and the information world in general have found ways to make use of information about knowing what customers want, where they're going, what they're shopping for, who they're talking to. The value of that information is no less valuable to us than it is to a Google or a Yahoo or anybody else. So when we think in terms of the economic model of this business, it's overly simplistic and, in fact, I think wrong to simply look at the former model and say, well, the classified business is gone. Of course it's gone. We've been disaggregated in each vertical by an online-only competitor. But there's a response to that. The industry hasn't made it yet, but there's clearly a response to it that has a robust and profound economic model attached to the value of the information that's derived from customer transactions.
And you're going to tell us what that is.
Would you like me to?
Yeah.
Well, the first thing is this. The people that compete with us in those individual verticals charge a fee for service. So in the newspaper industry historically, we've charged by the line. Well, digital-only competitors have been able to charge much less, but it's still a similar version of a charge per line. Because a newspaper is a much larger, more comprehensive organization, we make money in lots of different ways. We may well choose to give classified away as a way to re-aggregate the commercial side of our business. We haven't lost at all the audience. Our readership has never been higher than it has been. But what got disaggregated was particularly classified. We can re-aggregate it very quickly simply by giving it away. Now, I'll give you a Star Tribune example. In the automotive vertical, our digital revenue last year was $1 million. I might well be able to put that digital-only revenue for automotive at risk and invite all the car dealers to list all of their cars for sale, watch who's buying, watch who's selling in a timely basis, who's active in commerce in the Twin Cities at any one time, and make available that information with the permission of our readers to any number of commercial sources. That's the way a Google would look at this.
Right.
That model is open and available to us. And if we were to give away what our competitors have to charge for, I like our chance of winning. So that, in very short form, using just one vertical.
No, that's
an
great
example.
stuff. Tom?
Yeah, I think Jim did a superb job of describing briefly the structural phenomenon that led newspapers to be in the predicament that they are. And I think it's worth remembering that the railroad industry, the steamship industry, even the horse and buggy industry were sort of in analogous situations in moments, and all of those, I think, are a reason to be nervous about whether the news industry is capable of navigating a transition like this. I think everything that Michael said is right. I think there are a lot of good businesses embedded in the business that news represents. But I think a big question is what skill sets reside in these organizations. We are largely in the business in news of producing narratives and selling advertising to large advertisers to distribute, along with those narratives. One of the problems that even in the what Jim described has been true for 30 years. We've known it for a good 5 years, but the industry still doesn't know how, by and large, to get to small advertisers because it's so focused on large client advertisers. So the challenge here is to recognize what businesses may exist here and then also move in a lot of people who are not in these companies quickly, very quickly. The amount of revenue that you make in print is basically the time you've got left in the sand. What do you call it? In the hourglass. When that revenue is gradually disappears, you're out of time to reinvent, and that's basically where we're at. It's a race against the declining revenues of print for survival.
I see Ken nodding his head there.
Yeah, the hourglass is exactly it, and whether it's 3 to 5 years or 10 years, I think that's absolutely right. I just want to tie together, I think Meryl hitting on leadership is a very important point. And if we tie together that with the structural kinds of problems that Joel's talking about, there's a dynamic relationship there. And the truth is that the newspaper industry nurtured what we would call operators. The highest compliment you could say about a newspaper publisher for years was it was always a he's a good operator. The skill set that was needed by publishers in the last 15 years now, you could even say 20 years, has been lacking. And so they've missed search, they've missed paid search, they've missed video, they've missed mobile, they've missed about every phenomenon that has come along. Until we get, and I don't know if there's enough time in that hourglass to get enough people in who come from outside the industry and have the kind of passion that Mike has, to come into these enterprises who have public service values and have new ways of looking at this. Until we have that, I don't think anybody sees enough of the passion represented by Scott and Joel over here as well to be able to solve the structural problem. There's a dynamic relationship between leaders who are passionate about what the public needs, how to build companies for the future, and changing the structure around the funding of those businesses. And so I think there's a really interesting relationship going on.
Three great leaders in the field.
Right now?
Right now.
Right now, I would say, I'll point to. I want to stay away. I always want to decide whether to stay on people on panel or not.
No,
I would say.
I'm not going to define anything. I want Ken to
Okay,
answer.
I would say staying off the panel then for the moment. I mentioned the Global Post, which is an international news reporting site started by Phil Balboni, who came out of New England Cable News. I think that's a fascinating model where everybody has said there's not enough international news, and at the same time everybody said nobody will ever pay for it, there's no model for it, and he's got 74 new people, and these are all professional journalists reporting from all over the globe.
They're part-time.
They're all part-time, but they are all doing reporting that they were not doing before, and the audience is growing for that as well. In terms of leadership, I mentioned Jim Maroney in the presentation this morning.
Right.
Putting a stake in the ground and saying, you've got to improve the quality of what you're doing at the same time that you're going to price up, which we've talked about pricing. I think, I think that's important. And I would think a third one, and we haven't talked about this model here, Jonathan Weber, who does New West. We talk about regional journalism. I know there's a lot of talk about regional journalism in the public radio community. New West is a site that's been going for 5 years now. It's doing very high-grade journalism about the Rocky Mountain area. And this is a model. He also is not just sticking with advertising or subscriptions. He's got an event business. He's building something, but building it pretty quietly.
Thank you. Jim.
Again, the charge that I come today with is a foundation's perspective, and it is about healthy, rural Minnesota communities. A hero of mine and many Minnesotans is former Governor Elmer L. Anderson, who was a newspaper publisher for much of his career. A favorite quote of mine is when he talks about the role of newspapers in communities and states that one philosophy is for a newspaper to stand apart from its community and report. He provides a quote that he believes a newspaper in a community should be an inherent part of that community, its development and growth, and, quote, aid the community in achieving the dreams of its people. I know that that's idealistic. The conversation that we've had today necessarily has talked about business model, financial sustainability, and what model will survive. Have we given up on newspapers being a vital part of helping community people achieve dreams?
That's a powerful question. Merrill?
Well, I say the answer to that is yes, because the model is broken and it's too late and the hourglass is running out of sand.
Tough letter follows.
No. I was quoted in the New York Times 5 years ago as saying poorly run newspapers will fail. And I took a lot of heat because nobody saw bankruptcies coming and so on and so forth. And the evidence is mounting that poorly run newspapers will fail. They will fail across the country in a massive way. Well-run, creative newspapers that get their cost side under control and that are adventuresome, especially in revenue development, are going to succeed. And the same thing can be said about Minnesota Public Radio and just about everybody else who's under pressure. Well-run news and information companies who are not afraid of change will succeed. Poorly run will fail.
That's a lesson of life, not journalism.
But what's broken is not necessarily the basic business structure. What's broken is the creative opportunity that's at hand and people seizing it, Victor.
My nose is still there. I think. Okay. Thank you so much. Stick around, will you? Actually, it was a high point of my life, not the low point, because in one of Cyrano's sweeping gestures, as the thing fell, I caught it, threw it off stage, and nobody noticed, except me. So, Susan, you've been lying in the weeds here quietly.
Well, that's because I have no relevant experience. I'm only learning. I'm from the Federal Trade Commission. I can only speak for myself. But I've been doing a lot of listening, reading, and learning over the past several months in preparation for the FTC's workshops in early December. And it certainly sounds to me like the kinds of developing new types of businesses along with the news, as Tom Rosenstiel was talking about it this morning, thinking about the different elements that you have in your organization that you can offer as a service. Talking about, I forget, New West has an event business. You know, that has to be an important part of this because even, you know, the subscription model, you know, as I've learned from reading history, has never worked. Consumers have never, ever paid full freight for the news. The advertising model online is going to be, pardon?
I object to that, but go ahead.
Full, you know, all of the consumers? No, oh, or are you just objecting to the fact?
There are business models in which consumers do support publications right now. The
Which
Economist. The Economist.
Yes, but those, you know, I should clarify, that's an excellent point. Those tend to be news models where people need that kind of news for their business. So I would say it's more analogous to CQ and the Wall Street Journal than it is to Time Magazine or Newsweek, and we could, you know, argue about it. But if you look back in history in terms of civic news, typically there's been an under-demand for civic news, and you don't have consumers paying for the full freight for that.
I don't have current information on this, but this is old information. But in 1976, I worked for the London Sun, 5 million circulation daily newspaper. There was a worldwide newsprint shortage. We stopped carrying advertising for 6 months, and we made money on circulation alone.
I would submit that the British population is different from the American population.
I agree. I agree. No question.
And that was 1976, and you're not talking about it's free on the web.
I'd be glad to rent a room for you two.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to move on. I'm only going to say the advertising model is not clear how it's all going to develop online, and I'd love to hear more from John Rash about how that is, because I've certainly read Bob Garfield's chaos scenario, which basically says advertising is pretty much going to go away. There have to be, and I can only agree with the observation this morning that it's very difficult to get money out of the federal government. So
unless you're a bank.
Unless you're, yeah, unless you're on Wall Street, it's really tough.
Right, right.
I thought you were going to say I'm here from the federal government and I'm going to save you all.
Yeah, I only wish. I only wish.
Joel.
So.
That the well-managed will succeed and the less well-managed won't. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of truth to that. It's almost tautological that people who do things well.
I wish I'd used that word.
Yeah, people who do things well are going to figure out how to succeed. My concern is that what is it, I'm coming back to the structural question. Yes, leaders are needed to help institutions succeed. But the structure dictates what you can succeed at. So let's say, for example, the way to succeed in the public affairs news business is to cut your news staff in half, okay, and then you can succeed. But then we're left as a society with only half as many people doing journalism. And so to me, an awful lot of this is about structural questions. When I look at who's succeeding, I'm seeing a lot of success on the internet, but most of the people succeeding are succeeding with low-cost models, high on aggregation, low on original content creation, because that matches up with the revenues these people have figured out how to get. So yes, some people will succeed and others won't, but how much journalism can we support? And I want to add one more thing about that. This is why I have become a big supporter of the nonprofit model. I think for-profit models will succeed, but it was a bit of an historical accident that serious public affairs journalism was supported by a for-profit model. It was never because the public was paying for that serious journalism. It was the bundling phenomenon associated with the technology of the time. And the good news was that these publishers decided to support a lot of journalism, partly because it helped with the bundle and partly for other reasons, and that was a good thing for society. But going forward, I think we're going to have to see more nonprofit support, because I think that public affairs journalism is more of a community good than it is a consumer good. And then the last point about that is the nonprofit world is different than the for-profit world. And here I want to make a plea about something that I've not had much success with. I think in the nonprofit world, where we have a special tax status and where we are, people who donate to us get a deduction, there ought to be less competition and more cooperation, more divide. I'll do this and you do that, and we'll find ways to collectively serve the public good, because that's what our tax deduction gives us. And I haven't had very good success at getting other nonprofits to partner with us. So I got to work harder at that, but I'm telling you, I think that's a critical
that makes
element of
herding
this.
cats look easy, right? John?
Well, Joel, you're referencing, some of the structural dynamics and a lot of the people on the panel as well. And I referenced in my last comments, what is a newspaper and what does a media company look like as that hourglass, continues to lose some sand in it. And something that really hasn't been discussed, so I thought I'd quickly bring it up here, is that, of course, newspapers are not the only media industry that's facing some of these distinct challenges. And, anyone who's talked to, or had a cup of coffee with, or probably a beer with it now at this point, people at local television stations are facing some of the same fundamental challenges as well. And yet, when you look at what's happening with their business, they have almost the inverse issue that's going on with some of the printed organizations, be they magazines or newspapers, in terms of they have an almost, doubled, tripled, or almost quadrupled, at least in terms of technology, distribution model right now with the digital television transition that we just went through, and not anywhere near the amount of content creators to fill what they already have, meaning the main channels. And you have media organizations, newspapers, magazines, and others who have almost, certainly limited, but significantly more content creators than some of those. So that might be, the next area where not ownership models, because there are appropriate, FCC issues that will stop that from happening, but in terms of partnership in shared content and shared business plan models, that might really be a significant, alteration to the media equation right now, and might, in the classic form of what everyone looks for in a business deal, really be a win-win. So that's something that I think, building on my optimistic comments on before, that I think might be the next big area of growth as well.
Laura?
I wanted to pick up on comments on both leadership and structure in the nonprofit model. I think those of us in public media and in the nonprofit journalism field have not only the privilege, but also the obligation to think about ourselves first as mission-oriented organizations. And as you look at all this change, I look ahead and fear some certain things that I think we need to address. I think as you see this growing consolidation and you see vertical integration, there's going to be, I think the access to much journalism and information may be cut short. And I think we need to stand for access to all. I think there is a real danger that diverse voices will not be heard in a lot of the for-profit media as much as we need to hear as a nation. I think that as the for-profit world looks at readers and users as data, we need to look at readers, users, listeners as citizens of this democracy. And as there is more and more polemic and left and right, we need to think of a way to not only have accurate facts and journalism, but also to convene respectful dialogue and respectful debate, which I think is very, very rare these days. I do think that public media is well positioned to address many of these things, to make sure that there is access to all in what we're doing, to reflect diverse voices, to have deep local content, and also to dive deeply into areas of content areas. I think our reach into the African American community in New York has doubled in the last several years.
You have data for that,
yeah,
obviously.
Yeah, and with the Takeaway, which is our national program, we're finding that with some new styles, and we're able to reach both stations who are reaching, African American and communities in particular, and also attracting America by reflecting America.
Scott.
I want to just quickly, as a qualifier to what I'm going to say, is there's no one, I'm staying up every night, and I'm obsessed as much as anyone is with diversifying our revenue sources. So I want to make that clear with the idea that we are raising money and we're working very hard on it. But I disagree with Joel and my good friend on one point, that I don't think this is a revenue problem. I think it's a cost problem. I think that you mentioned, Mr. Sweeney, that you have $200 million in revenue. Imagine your distribution costs, your distribution costs being 10,000. Imagine if the distribution costs of the video and the audio and the online version of this entity were $0 or $10,000. We are trending toward that. We are trending toward the ability to distribute for little or no money at all. And I think that that frees up an enormous amount of money. And when I say that I'm still working hard to diversify our revenue, what I'm trying to do is prove that our particular mission is worth part of the revenue that's out there, or part of, or new, more exciting people getting involved in it. And so I think that we have to look at the nonprofit not just as a non-market-based solution as well, but also it's actually a very pure market solution in the sense that we are asking the community to look at us and value us according to their means and provide us an exchange for service. It's a very pure market relationship, one in which an auction literally goes on in that person's head.
Scott, maybe I'm the only one who didn't understand. You said it's not a revenue problem, it's a cost problem. Then you showed us there's no cost. So what are you talking about?
Well, I'm saying that they've voluntarily maintained these costs that they don't need to. Over time, it's going to be less and less required. Even internet publications right now are spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on content management systems and other things that do not, that are not required. The barrier to entry to publishing relatively good blogs and websites is getting lower and lower and lower, to the point where I think it's going to trend to people actually paying us to do it. And I think that this may sound crazy, but it's already happening. And if you spend $100,000 building a website, you should rethink that. And I think the only distance then is actually quality of content and quality of design, and that's the differentiator. And that's the level of cost that you're going to have to maintain. But I can right now record something on my iPhone and have it broadcast on a website that somebody in Tehran listens to. Well, if they have access. But the point is that the distribution problem is trending towards zero, and I think that that the revenue that is freed up by that will help support the kind of public affairs missions that we've been very worried about losing.
Let me ask Tom what the implications of what Scott's saying are for public radio in particular. Will you focus that for me, because we have a pretty expensive operation.
Right. Well, let me respond to that directly and then pivot to public radio to the extent that I can. It's true that distribution costs are going down. And it's true that dissemination is becoming easier and easier, and that's significant financially and from a civic standpoint. But it's not true that all the newspapers in America are hanging on to their print editions out of nostalgia. You make 85% of your revenue from print. You get rid of your print edition, and you might reduce your cost by 50%. Well, I'm an English major, but even I know that getting rid of 50% of your costs, but losing 85% of your revenue doesn't really add up very well. So there's newspapers generated $45 billion in revenue last year. That's a lot of money. If they eliminated their print editions, they could save half their cost, but most of the revenue would go away. And there isn't a lot of, there isn't $45 billion or even $20 billion in nonprofit money that could sort of disappear every year into supporting the news business. So if we want to think about the news, just even newspapers at the scale that they're looking at, there is a revenue problem that needs to be resolved. And the problem is that going out and gathering news and then having an HR department to, sue the people, the employees, and do all the other things that HR departments do, it's expensive. And you probably want a marketing department, and you probably might even want an advertising department. So there are a lot of costs associated with gathering news and distributing it that go beyond dissemination. And if you're a big company, you're trying to figure out how to manage those costs, but without sort of eliminating your, weakening your brand. It is easier, I think, to imagine this when you're a small, new company and everything that you're building is new, is sort of an addition that's building your brand. Okay, to answer your question, what the challenges facing public radio are that on a national level, they do a great job of producing audio. But moving online and producing content that can make them a true internet content provider is a challenge that they haven't quite figured out. The problem for local public radio is they're not much of a content creator. They're mostly a content provider, mostly from national public radio. Minnesota Public Radio and American Public Radio is the exception to that. But most public radio stations around the country don't produce a lot of great content, and particularly a lot of shoe leather reporting. Another challenge for public radio is, we've talked about Watchdog, public radio does a superb job at features, at lifestyle, at doing stories that nobody else does, but the sort of civic watchdog reporting, exposés that land you in court and throw the mayor into jail, that's not really what public radio is known for around the country, for a lot of different reasons. So the challenges here are, how do you convert from an audio platform to a multimedia platform? And all of that is making your costs go up. Everything in front of public radio is making their costs go up.
Well,
could I respond just really quick? Sure. Well, thanks. The variable I'm trying to solve for is not to save newspapers, and I don't think that if I were in charge of a newspaper that I would do that, and nor do I dance at their grave at all. This is an incredibly trying moment for our history. What I'm saying is that if the variable you're trying to solve for is public affairs journalism, the distribution costs are nearing zero and might even switch the other way. And I think that that we have to take that into account as we try to solve for that. And that's all I'm saying, is that, if we think of newspapers as being the only entity to provide that, then yes, you're right. But I just think that there's an opportunity to solve for that variable differently.
I'm not sure we disagree about the distribution costs. I think the issue here is, how much is there a cost in the cost of producing the news, not disseminating it?
Merrill?
Being negative for, I want to be really positive and be supportive of some things that have been said here, but with a little more emphasis. The local advertising opportunity for smallish players, and even for larger players, of course, over the next few years is going to be enormous on the internet. In the late 90s, we spent an enormous amount of money building content sites and underinvesting in advertising. Advertising didn't develop on a national basis until the 2000s. The same thing is about to happen in local, and that every thoughtful forecast you read about the local advertising opportunity over the next few years suggests it's going to be enormous as newspapers continue to underperform and television stations remain vastly overpriced. So whether it's New West, which I happen to be an advisor to and help them raise money, or whether it's Joel's project in Minneapolis, this is a plea to get people to engage in advertising, and the soliciting of it and the creation of tools to gather it in a low-cost way. It's every bit as important, and it's every bit as large an opportunity as the content creation part of this. And yes, there is a business model consistent with what Scott says about scale. There is a business model that can work. Can advertising ever support 1,500 people in the New York Times newsroom? No, and this discussion gets too hung up on that fact. But there's going to be an enormous amount of local advertising that can support projects like Joel's and New West and Scott's.
Okay. I think that's the last word on that. Doug?
I do think that there's a little bit of a sense of loss in that we have a recollection of a robust journalism that was paid for by local and regional monopolies that newspapers owned, that they could monetize in a way that you've never seen in journalism before and probably will not see again. And the problem is that if we're hoping for that, we have to come up with something equivalent. And I think that's going to be very, very hard to come up with, because although there is going to be robust advertising that newspapers and others can participate in, it's going to be a far more competitive marketplace going forward. The monopoly aspect is gone. Furthermore, newspapers do have some disadvantages. It's harder to search classifieds. They have, and I'm sure Michael's run into this too, the cost, if you take aside the last 9 months, the cost of newsprint has been going up 4, 5, 6, 7 times in a single year. Part of it is the obsolescence of the equipment out there, and the fact that nobody's investing in newsprint making machines because they see newspaper demand is going down over time. So the real costs continue to go up. It's still an enormous business, and it's still generating hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. But if you look at it strategically long term, it's lost its monopoly status. It has inherent costs that are going to keep going up, and the cost digitally of the distribution side, not the information gathering side, are trending towards zero. So the question is, are we going to find some way to focus on other new ways of financing and paying for news gathering capability, regardless of what institution they exist in? And there were some complaints about public radio not having the investigative chops or background in it. Maybe it doesn't see that as its role. I think we're going to have to look really closely at these roles in the future, because there are relatively small numbers of organizations right now that have the inherent capacity to do the kinds of journalism we've seen in the past, and we're going to have to come up with new ways to help pay for it. But in the end, we're going to have to do it for less cost, less revenue than we've had available to us in the past.
Mr. Kinsey.
Just to pick up on some of the things that Tom said when he was talking about the difficulties that public media, public radio in particular, may face in getting into this. I think one of the advantages it has is the fact that it's not encumbered by that monopoly status. It has not been a central dominant player particularly in the local news arena, and therefore finds it easier to behave like the kind of startup that Scott's describing, that you can pick a different geographic territory if that's the appropriate thing to do looking forward, as opposed to being locked into one that you've traditionally served. We obviously have the advantage of having created over 40 years a very direct association between the news values the news that we produce and the values that we stand behind, and the idea of individual personal contribution. That's something that I think takes a long time to build up, and is something that a lot of other organizations are sort of circling around as they look for business models, but we'll probably find that it takes a lot of time to develop. That in turn opens up the opportunity, I think, for us to partner with other startups and other organizations that are trying to put together some sort of hybrid model that depends partly on advertising or corporate underwriting and partly on individual contribution and other sources of support.
Laura?
I think, Tom, the challenges that you speak of for public media and public radio in particular are real. But I also think that there's some real advantages that we have. When clearly we all are trying to figure out how to move from audio to multimedia, to add video, to figure it out. And I think that there are probably more stations than you know of, than we all know of, that are producing a lot of content. I think what we do have is, we may not have a lot of investigative journalism, although it does exist, and certainly at NPR and at some of our stations. I think, though, we have a real ability to do explanatory journalism, which I think is very rare and very needed. If you think of the Planet Money kind of things that NPR and This American Life have been doing, our own kind of explanation on the media, about the media industry, which no one else is really doing. I think we also have a role and a unique ability to convene debates and discussions and hear people's perspectives. And on the partnership piece, I think we have to get better at reducing our own costs. If you look at, even the cost of creating a large number of features in the NPR or public radio way versus doing some talk programming. I think there are some ways that we too can cut our costs. As we developed the takeaway, we did it in partnership with the New York Times, the BBC, WGBH, and certainly PRI, our partner. We are, so we're trying to leverage other people's expertise, and I think that's going to be the future, and we'd love to talk to you too. And we do partnerships with ProPublica on investigative journalism. And the other thing that I think that public media has is some experience with raising money from diversified revenue sources, and I think that is the future in terms of the nonprofit model, that it's about the corporate sponsorship, the membership, the philanthropy, and it's about kind of figuring out new ways of raising money on the internet. But I do think that there's challenges for both, for the federal government and for CPB. I think CPB would say they don't have enough money to support the kind of content that's out there. And I think we have to try to figure out how we can help them help us. And I think that it's a challenge for philanthropy. And then finally, I agree that we have to figure out how to get new leaders into the public media world and also to support those that have the vision.
We have to figure out how to get new leaders into all parts of our world. Isn't that right? Michael.
When I listen to the discussion of our distinguished panelists, it occurs to me that it's so hard for people who grew up in the newspaper business to think about these as news organizations and information organizations, not like newspapers. So many of the comments that I've heard have gone back to the classified advertising model is broken, or you don't make your money in circulation. That's true. But I ask you, now that we're all in an information world, to think more like an information company and less like the newspaper organizations that you grew up in. But I think a big issue that we should talk about is the government's role in funding news. Certainly there are journalistic considerations, but I would suggest to you that today what we've got is government-funded organizations trying to recruit people away from our newsroom. Is that right? Is that the public policy stance that we want to have? Taking people out of a unionized newsroom into a non-unionized newsroom is also a public policy. In a time where there's so much need in our society, what we're looking at in the news world is one of the most robust, innovative, competitive environments I've ever seen in business. Just look at all the different ideas that we're talking about today. There's no shortage of innovation here, and I would suggest to you there's no real need for government to take money away from healthcare or the economy or all the other needs that government has to fund to go compete with for-profit businesses that are fully functioning and serving the community well.
I'm going to go to the audience now. Forgive me, Ken, but time has come to see if we get some contributions from the audience, and I'd like to see Jim.
Oh, hi, Richard Gingras, Salon Media. I'd just like to throw in a bit of sort of factual basis for Scott's comment about the challenge going forward is more about constraining costs.
You're going to confuse us with facts?
I'm going to confuse you with facts, at least about traditional media organizations. And I say this myself having a very, very optimistic sense of the future of journalism going forward. But if you look at the raw numbers today, just to point out a couple of things. Salon Media, for instance, in 2008, we monetized, which is all online, our revenue per 1,000 page views was about $12. When I worked for Google, I spent a lot of time working with the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I can tell you in about the same period, their revenue per 1,000 pages online was about $8 or $9. Those numbers are fairly good and consistent for content properties on the web. We may all like to believe that they will increase significantly going forward, and that might be the case, but order of magnitude roughly around there. Salon's costs per 1,000 page views overall in 2008 was about the same, about $12. We lost a bit of money in 2008. Tougher this year. Looking at traditional media organizations, an analysis looking at the New York Times costs, which I did outside the Times, though I've had other people verify that if anything they were conservative, would suggest that if you look at the Times cost structure just for digital, if you assume that they keep the entire editorial operation, which is what Arthur would like to do, and then only associated costs necessary for the digital operation, including sales, then the cost per 1,000 page views at the New York Times, again, this is 17 million uniques a month, so you're talking about a lot of page views, is somewhere in excess of $65. So you got, again, $10 in revenue per 1,000 page views, $65 in cost per 1,000 page views. That's a huge delta. Obviously, because of what we talked about, the dynamics being so different. Monopolistic driven revenue structure in the old form, completely open, commoditized revenue structure in the new form. So it is indeed a huge challenge for those traditional media properties to figure out how to get their costs in line with any realistic sense of revenue in the online environment.
Thank you, Richard. Question? Mr. Amy.
This is directed to Mr. Sweeney. I fear, if I understood your comments regarding governmental support of media, you were directing them to the existence of public media as distinguished from profit media, profit news institutions and the like. And I just have to disagree with you completely on that. Perhaps the fact that where we are sitting in NPR provides very direct competition to your particular journal is a problem for you. I would hope not. I would hope you would treat it as appropriate competition that you can meet in any appropriate way, bearing in mind that you're there for profit and NPR is not. There is a space to be filled, at least many of us think, with regard to what is provided by the public media that is not filled by those organizations which operate for a profit and not by commercial broadcasters or the like. For just one example, in-depth reporting, the kind of materials that are put on public radio and public television, which, at least in my experience, one does not see customarily on the broadcast or even cable. And indeed, the sound bites that one gets on both the cable and network news should be a good example of what is good in that particular area, but which fortunately is not duplicated for the most part in public media. And one last mention, you referred to the economy and suggesting that perhaps the government could do better putting its money into the economy. Well, supporting the public media does put its money into the economy. There are people employed in various places. There are structures to be built. And indeed, some of us thought that one of the ways to help turn the economy around, indeed, was to put more money into public media.
Thank you, Bruce.
Well, I'd like to just quickly respond to that,
Sure.
since they were directed to me. I think we're closer in agreement than you might think. I've been personally a contributor to public radio and public television, and I think you're right. There is a role for public radio and for public television, particularly in areas that the commercial society won't support, the capitalist society won't support. So the original construct of Minnesota Public Radio, I'm a big supporter of. I think where we might differ is when government or large foundations even fund a direct competitor for fully functioning for-profit businesses in what becomes a market share battle. It's not necessary. It's not a place for government to weigh in. So while I'm a big supporter of Minnesota Public Radio and public television because it was necessary and it provided a good service, I think what we now have is an expansion of the boundaries of the mission to a level that is, in my view, unnecessary.
Bruce, you should identify yourself.
I think we have a public option here. I think this is what basically is going on.
I'm not, I've been asked to identify myself. My name is Bruce Raymer. I'm from Los Angeles on the board of CPB, and I oppose most public options, other than public media.
Thank you, Bruce.
Of course, except my own. Yeah.
Who else would like to join in?
Thanks. My name is Lori Gilbert, and I'm also a board member with CPB, and I would like to represent the position of rural America and thank Jim Houlihan in particular. If I was putting together a little picture panel of what I've gained here today, I'm from Elko, Nevada, and so I represent rural, and I go back to the roots of CPB, the mission of 1967, to serve the largely underserved. I would put Jim Houlihan, and I would put Scott Lewis. I would put Robert Stevens on my panel. And just to mix it up, I would probably put Michael and Tom, just to mix it up a little. But I wanted to thank all of you for participating. But I think it's important that we also remember what the CPB is our mission is, and that is to serve the underserved, and that includes rural America. And thank you, Jim, for coming today.
All right. Stephanie, do we still have time for the panel or not?
You can throw another question. We've got 2 more minutes, so someone's got something really, really good to say.
Well,
no pressure, but please.
Okay. Who'll step up to that?
I think Jeff Cole's stepping up to that.
I do have a question.
Will you identify yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Malcolm McDonald, and I'd like to put a different type of a question. Michael, it's not really either or. In many cases, it's both and I think you and I would agree on that. But I'd like to put a different kind of question to the panel, and it's this. As we take a look at the American workforce, there are 82 million Americans, according to the household surveys, who don't participate in the workforce. There are also roughly 80 million Americans who don't read or don't read well enough. And there are about that number or more who didn't vote in the last election. How is it that we don't have much more focus on having young people encouraged to read, older people who have difficulty reading encouraged to improve their reading skills, and all of you who really depend one way or another upon people reading, focusing on the ongoing story of what it will take for more Americans to read. The other side of the story, the bad side of the story, is the increase in this number and what it means longer term for our society, which is an increasing number of people who don't participate. So I put to you that there is a challenge for all of you, regardless of sides you might take on some of this, to take a look as to how we get not an either or, but much more of a both and society. And I look for your comments.
All right. That's a challenge. Who on the panel would respond? John.
That's a perfect opportunity to endorse the simple elegance, free access, and efficiency of radio. We at Minnesota Public Radio, and certainly those that know me well, know that I'm very bullish on radio. And I think while we wouldn't necessarily make a case for one technology or one news organization, the issues you raise are not necessarily directly addressed, but completely integrated with free access to public information through free radio. And Mike, to your earlier point, I think that is also partially the justification for societal support for public information. We don't trust entirely the free marketplace for public health. We don't trust entirely the free marketplace for public safety. We don't trust the free marketplace entirely for public education. And I think the point that's made there, and certainly the support of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and certainly those of us committed to public media, understand our obligation to provide free public information in the same way. And I really appreciate the point being raised, and I think while there are many radios sold in America, most of them come with a car, and we need to understand that you got it, good. I almost brought a radio with me just to have it sitting here because it's very inexpensive, and there's no subscription fee for it, and some of the best information and cultural programming in the world is in the palm of your hand. And now with Mr. Jobs, and I'm sure many of the other Palm devices that will be FM and radio equipped, we all have direct access to one of the simplest, cheapest technologies. Thank you very much. I almost took mine out. We all have access to that, and I think that can make at least a small contribution to the kind of access that you were talking about.
Well, look, we've come to the end of the hour, except, Jeff, you've been lying low. I want to hear a final word from you.
I've been lying low because I was given so much time this morning. I think it would have been piggy to dominate here. Just a couple, what we're describing on the panel is so painful. These are seismic changes that are so disruptive, so challenge and change everything we've grown up with. But I think it's important to understand if there were all of a sudden, we'll stay with newspapers for a moment, a paper reading virus and newspapers disappeared overnight, to me it would be extremely painful. The phrase I use, partially to be silly, but I really mean it, is breakfast just wouldn't make sense anymore. But to anyone under 40, they wouldn't notice. And they're happy with the way they're getting news. Now, we can tell them they shouldn't be. We can tell them it's not satisfactory. We know, for example, that the news they get on Google and Yahoo and MSN, that they don't care about the source, so the source is there. We can tell them everything that's wrong, but I think it's important to remember that those people who are getting their news this way feel informed, feel that they're satisfied with what they're getting. So there is an age issue here, and this is, to us who've grown up with this, incredibly painful. But to them, this is just the way it is.